Consider this scenario. A young Japanese serviceman, no older than 23, finds himself confined to a cramped prison barrack in the American heartland of Kansas. He is Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka. Just 3 months prior, his battlefield was a Pacific island, awash in the blood of conflict with American Marines. Now, on a sweltering August afternoon in 1943, he is on the cusp of an experience that will fundamentally alter his perception of America far more profoundly than any propaganda. The clang of the mess hall bell echoes across the compound. As Tanaka joins the throng of hundreds of fellow Japanese detainees shuffling in line, he prepares himself for the familiar thin broth and a slice of stale bread, accepting it as the grim reality of wartime captivity. However, when the American mess sergeant places a metal tray before him, Tanaka freezes in astonishment. A generous serving of savory beef stew sends up fragrant steam. Fresh, vibrant vegetables gleam under the harsh fluorescent lights. A chilled glass of milk sits beside perfectly baked bread rolls, and, improbably, nestled on the tray, is a small dish of vanilla ice cream, condensation beating on its cold surface. For a long moment, Tanaka is rendered immobile. In wartime Japan, such culinary luxuries were rarely afforded, even to high-ranking officials. Yet here he is, an enemy combatant, being served dessert within an American detention facility. This is the narrative of one of the Second World War's most overlooked cultural dislocations. It reveals how Japanese prisoners of war discovered an abundance in their captor's nation so immense, so beyond comprehension, that their enemies lived more comfortably than many Japanese citizens. To fully grasp the magnitude of this cultural encounter, we must rewind to December 7, 1941. On that fateful day, Japanese aircraft descended upon Pearl Harbor, propelling America into a conflict it had desperately sought to evade. That date, famously declared by President Roosevelt as one that will live in infamy, not only plunged the United States into global hostilities across two vast theaters, but also laid the groundwork for one of the most unexpected prisoner exchanges in military history. By 1941, Japan had been embroiled in warfare for over a decade. This protracted struggle began with the invasion of Manchuria in 1931, followed by a full-scale offensive against China in 1937. By the time the attack on Pearl Harbor shattered America's isolationist stance, Japanese society had been thoroughly reoriented into a war machine, solely focused on production and sacrifice. In Japan's urban centers, survival hinged on ration cards. A typical Japanese civilian in 1943, if fortunate, subsisted on a meager 1,800 calories daily. Rice, the very cornerstone of Japanese sustenance, had become so scarce that families resorted to mixing it with sawdust and tree bark to augment their meager portions. Sugar was a relic of peacetime. Meat was relegated to the realm of hungry children's fantasies. Japanese soldiers fared little better. The Imperial Army's stringent discipline extended to its nutritional standards, or rather, the lack thereof. A Japanese infantryman's daily sustenance typically consisted of rice, vegetables, and occasional fish. Meat was reserved for special observances or officers' meals. Dairy products were practically non-existent. Japan's agricultural infrastructure had never developed the scale of cattle farming necessary to make milk, butter, or ice cream commonplace. Simultaneously across the vast Pacific, America was navigating its own form of wartime austerity. Yet, this perceived sacrifice would appear as unparalleled plenty to Japanese eyes. Indeed, Americans contended with rationing. Coffee, sugar, gasoline, and specific cuts of meat required ration coupons. Victory gardens bloomed in backyards nationwide as families cultivated their own produce to free up commercial crops for the war effort. Nevertheless, even American rationing operated on a scale of opulence that Japanese civilians could scarcely imagine. When Americans lamented having only 2 pounds of sugar per month, they were oblivious to the fact that most Japanese families hadn't tasted refined sugar in years. While American housewives grudgingly substituted margarine for butter, Japanese mothers had long forgotten the appearance of either spread. This stark disparity transcended mere resource allocation. It symbolized two fundamentally divergent philosophies of warfare. Japan had embraced total mobilization, directing every grain of rice and every ounce of steel towards military production. The home front was expected to endure, to sacrifice, and to demonstrate devotion through deprivation. America, conversely, had discovered that abundance itself could be employed as a weapon. American factories did not solely churn out tanks and aircraft. They continued producing consumer goods, recognizing that maintaining civilian morale was paramount to sustaining a global war effort. Remarkably, American ice cream production persisted throughout the war. In fact, the United States commissioned a fleet of ice cream delivery vessels and a floating ice cream barge to serve troops in the Pacific. Yes, you read that correctly. While Japanese soldiers were subsisting on their limited rice rations, America was constructing mobile ice cream facilities. The initial contingent of Japanese prisoners of war arrived in American camps in early 1942, captured in the chaotic aftermath of Pearl Harbor and during the nascent Pacific campaigns. Unlike the substantial influx of German and Italian prisoners, who would later overwhelm American detention facilities, Japanese captives arrived in small numbers, a few here, a dozen there. This was not indicative of American reluctance to apprehend Japanese soldiers. Rather, it reflected the brutal nature of Pacific combat and the ingrained military culture of Japan. The Bushido Code, which guided Japanese military thinking, deemed capture the ultimate dishonor. Death in battle was considered preferable to the shame of surrender. Many Japanese soldiers fought until their last round, then used it upon themselves rather than face the ignominy of captivity. Those who did survive capture often did so due to debilitating injuries that rendered them incapable of resistance, or because they were rendered unconscious during combat. Even in such circumstances, many awoke in American field hospitals expecting torture and execution, perpetuating the myths disseminated by Japanese propaganda regarding American barbarity. The journey to American POW camps was, in itself, a revelation for these captured soldiers. In stark contrast to the horrific conditions of cattle cars and death marches that characterized Axis mistreatment of Allied prisoners, Japanese POWs found themselves traveling in passenger trains, equipped with cushioned seating and spotless windows. They were provided with regular sustenance during their transit. Medical personnel diligently attended to wounded prisoners throughout the journey. For men indoctrinated to believe that Americans were savage, subhuman monsters, this humane treatment represented the first significant crack in their deeply ingrained worldview. However, nothing could have prepared them for what awaited them within the camps themselves. In the United States, at the conclusion of the Second World War, there were numerous prisoner of war camps, comprising 175 main facilities and 501 branch camps, holding over 425,000 prisoners of war, predominantly German. Japanese prisoners, representing a considerably smaller demographic, were typically housed in designated sectors of these larger installations, or in specialized camps established for Pacific Theater detainees. The camps were dispersed across the American Midwest, in states such as Kansas, Texas, Colorado, and Arkansas, situated away from coastal areas where security concerns were most acute, but also in regions where the vast bounty of American agriculture was most conspicuously on display. Upon crossing the camp perimeters, Japanese prisoners encountered a reality that defied every preconceived notion they held about incarceration. The barracks, though undeniably basic and military in design, were clean, weather-resistant, and heated. Each detainee was allocated a bunk, equipped with a mattress, blankets, and a small locker for personal effects. Compared to the overcrowded, disease-ridden conditions they had endured in Japanese military barracks, the accommodations in American POW facilities appeared almost palatial. Yet, it was the food that truly dismantled their preconceptions. American POW camps operated in accordance with the Geneva Convention, which stipulated that prisoners receive rations equivalent to those provided to their captors' own soldiers. What the Japanese prisoners failed to initially comprehend was that American soldiers consume better fare than most Japanese officers. That inaugural meal in captivity became a moment of profound cultural dissonance for virtually every Japanese prisoner. Men who had subsisted on bowls of thin soup and handfuls of rice were suddenly presented with plates piled high with roasted meat, fresh vegetables, and white bread so soft it yielded to the slightest pressure. Then came the dairy products. Milk, genuine cow's milk, appeared on their tables daily. For many Japanese prisoners, fresh milk was an entirely novel experience. Japan's agricultural system primarily focused on rice, vegetables, and fish, with dairy playing a negligible role in the traditional diet. The initial sip was often met with a mixture of suspicion and wonder, as these men realized that Americans possessed such an abundance of milk that they could freely offer it to their adversaries. Butter, cheese, and eggs, items so scarce in Japan that they existed primarily in the memories of older generations, were regularly featured on American prison camp menus. But nothing more vividly symbolized American affluence than ice cream. Imagine being 19 years old, raised in a society where every grain of rice is precious, where your mother dilutes soup to make it last another day, where the most cherished childhood treat was a single piece of hard candy shared among 3 siblings. Now, envision being served ice cream, cold, sweet, and creamy, by the very individuals you have been taught to regard as mortal enemies. This was the reality for thousands of Japanese prisoners of war in American camps. Detainees were astounded to find numerous items available for purchase that were unobtainable back home due to shortages and rationing, including cigarettes and, in some camps, beer and ice cream. The prison canteens, where prisoners could spend their modest earnings from camp labor, offered goods that had not been seen in Japanese cities for years. Sergeant Tanaka, whose story opened our documentary, did not immediately consume the ice cream he was served in the camp mess hall on his first encounter. He gazed at the small dish, observing the vanilla slowly melting in the Kansas heat, struggling to process its implications for his captors and their society. In Japan, ice was a coveted luxury. Refrigeration was available in major urban centers, but mechanical freezing for something as seemingly frivolous as dessert was unimaginable during wartime. Ice cream, if it existed at all, was reserved for the most affluent families during peacetime celebrations. Yet here, in a detention facility designed to house enemy soldiers, American mess sergeants routinely served ice cream as a standard menu item. Other prisoners recounted similar experiences. Corporal Kenji Yamamoto, captured during the Battle of Guadalcanal, later reminisced about his first encounter with chocolate ice cream at Camp Robinson, Arkansas. He described the moment in his post-war memoirs. "I could not comprehend how these Americans, who were purportedly enduring a great war, could expend milk, sugar, and labor on such a luxury for their prisoners. Either their propaganda about wartime sacrifice was entirely fictitious, or their nation possessed wealth beyond imagination. The truth, it turned out, leaned closer to the latter. To comprehend why American camps served ice cream to enemy combatants, we must examine the American approach to prisoner management and the unique logistical capabilities that facilitated such apparent extravagance. Firstly, there was the matter of international law and American military doctrine. The United States adhered to its Geneva Convention commitments seriously, driven partly by genuine humanitarian concerns, but also by pragmatic considerations. American military leaders understood that treating enemy prisoners humanely encouraged surrender, potentially shortening conflicts and saving American lives. However, beyond legal mandates, there was an intrinsic American characteristic to the abundance that Japanese prisoners encountered. Even under wartime rationing, American food production operated on an industrial scale that Japanese planners had never envisioned. In 1943, the United States was not only sustaining its own population of 140 million, but also providing food to Britain through Lend-Lease programs, feeding millions of Allied troops globally, and maintaining agricultural exports to neutral nations. Despite this immense demand, American farms continued to generate surpluses. Ice cream production serves as a perfect illustration of this abundance. This widespread enthusiasm for ice cream led the Navy to invest $1 million in the construction of a floating ice cream factory during the Second World War. The American military did not merely tolerate ice cream production during wartime. It actively promoted it as essential for maintaining morale. American soldiers anticipated ice cream. It appeared in field rations, at base mess halls, and aboard naval vessels. The renowned ice cream barges that served Pacific Fleet personnel became symbols of American resolve to preserve a semblance of normalcy and quality of life, even in combat zones. For Japanese prisoners, this revelation was both humbling and deeply unsettling. If America could afford to provide ice cream to its adversaries, what did that portend for America's capacity to wage war? How could Japan possibly hope to defeat a nation so affluent that it treated luxuries as necessities? The shock of ice cream was but one facet of a broader cultural collision that defined the daily existence of Japanese prisoners in American camps. Every element of the prison routine illuminated the vast chasm between Japanese and American societies during wartime. Consider breakfast. A typical morning meal for a Japanese soldier, when available, consisted of rice, pickled vegetables, and wheat tea. In American POW camps, breakfast typically featured eggs, bacon, toast with butter, fresh fruit, and coffee. Real coffee, not the ersatz substitutes that Japanese civilians had been consuming for years. The sheer volume of food was astounding. American military doctrine emphasized nutrition as critical for maintaining both physical and mental well-being, even among prisoners. Japanese prisoners often found themselves unable to finish their meals, their stomachs, accustomed to near-starvation rations, unable to cope with the sheer quantity of food. Weight gain among Japanese prisoners became a common occurrence. Men who had arrived gaunt and malnourished from months of insufficient rations began to fill out within weeks of their internment in American camps. Medical records from the prison camps document average weight increases of between 20 and 30 pounds among Japanese prisoners during their initial year of confinement. This physical transformation was accompanied by psychological shifts that camp administrators meticulously observed. Japanese prisoners grappled with reconciling their pre-war perceptions of American society with the reality they witnessed daily. Many had been led to believe that Americans were a soft, decadent populace, destined to falter under the strain of prolonged warfare. Yet, the evidence suggested precisely the opposite. A society so robust and so abundantly resourced that it could extend generosity to its enemies, even while engaged in a global conflict on multiple fronts. The work assignments within the camps provided another glimpse into American prosperity. Japanese prisoners were generally assigned to agricultural labor, involved in harvesting crops, maintaining camp facilities, or assisting in camp kitchens. These roles offered them first-hand exposure to American agricultural techniques and food distribution systems. Prisoners working in the camp kitchens were particularly struck by the quantity of food wastage they observed. Portions that could have sustained entire Japanese families for days were sometimes discarded due to minor staleness. The sheer scale of American food production rendered minor spoilage acceptable rather than catastrophic. As 1943 transitioned into 1944, accounts of conditions within American POW camps began to circulate back to Japan through prisoner exchanges and diplomatic channels. The descriptions seemed so implausible that Japanese military intelligence initially dismissed them as Allied disinformation. Ice cream for prisoners, an unthinkable notion. Daily meat rations for enemy soldiers, beyond comprehension. However, as more reports arrived, corroborated by Red Cross inspections and observations from neutral diplomatic envoys, a disquieting realization began to dawn upon Japanese military strategists. If these accounts were factual, if America truly possessed such overwhelming affluence that it could treat its adversaries more favorably than Japan treated its own populace, then perhaps the Imperial Army had underestimated its opponent far more catastrophically than anyone had previously imagined. The ice cream served in American POW camps was not merely a dessert. It was a potent symbol of industrial might, agricultural surplus, and a societal organization that suggested Japan might be engaged in a conflict it could never win. But the full ramifications of this abundance, and how it would ultimately redefine the Pacific War, would only become apparent when returning Japanese prisoners began sharing stories that no one in Japan was willing to believe. Tokyo, March 1944. In a windowless chamber deep within the Imperial General Staff Headquarters, Colonel Masahiko Takashita was engrossed in intelligence reports that defied logical interpretation. According to multiple sources, including prisoner exchanges, diplomatic cables, and Red Cross inspections, American POW camps were providing their Japanese captives with meals that surpassed the rations allotted to Japanese field officers. The colonel placed one particularly detailed report on his desk, rubbing his weary eyes. If these accounts were accurate, enemy prisoners in American camps were consuming more calories daily than most Japanese civilians had experienced in 3 years of war. Yet, It was the concluding paragraph that truly unsettled him. Prisoners report regular servings of ice cream, chocolate, and fresh dairy products. American camp commanders appear to consider these items essential rather than luxury goods. Ice cream for prisoners of war. Colonel Takashita had not tasted ice cream himself since before the commencement of the China incident in 1937. His own children had never experienced such a delicacy. Nevertheless, according to these reports, Japan's captured soldiers, men who had brought shame upon the emperor through their surrender, were enjoying luxuries far beyond the reach of even the most loyal Japanese citizens. The implications were profound, extending far beyond the confines of camp mess halls. The reports filtering into Tokyo presented an unprecedented intelligence conundrum for Japanese military planners. How does one process information that fundamentally challenges one's core assumptions about the enemy? Since the early 1930s, Japanese propaganda had consistently portrayed America as a nation populated by soft, materialistic individuals who would inevitably collapse under the pressure of sustained warfare. The attack on Pearl Harbor was partly predicated on the belief that Americans, lacking the spiritual fortitude of Japanese warriors, would seek a negotiated peace after experiencing initial setbacks. However, the evidence emerging from the POW camps suggested an entirely different reality. A society so resilient, so bountifully provisioned, that it could afford to be magnanimous towards its adversaries, even while prosecuting a global war on two extensive fronts. The psychological warfare implications were immediate and deeply concerning. If news of these conditions were to spread among Japanese troops, would it encourage surrender? Would soldiers begin to view capture not as the ultimate disgrace, but as a pathway to living conditions superior to those they had known, even in peacetime Japan? Japanese military censors faced an insurmountable task. They could attempt to suppress reports concerning POW camp conditions, but they could not erase the tangible evidence when exchanged prisoners returned to Japan, carrying extra weight and recounting tales of American plenty. The issue extended beyond individual testimonies. Red Cross inspections of American camps were conducted by impartial observers, including Swiss diplomats who submitted comprehensive reports to international organizations. These documents, disseminated through diplomatic channels, presented a consistent portrayal of American POW camps that demonstrably exceeded Geneva Convention requirements. One Swiss inspection report from Camp Concordia in Kansas noted, prisoners receive 3 full meals daily, including meat, vegetables, dairy products, and dessert. Kitchen facilities are modern and sanitary. Activities for leisure included athletics, instructional courses, and amusement. The provision of medical services appeared complete. The clinical terminology employed in the report could not conceal its groundbreaking ramifications for individuals reading in Japan. If unbiased observers ascertained that America was treating adversaries captured in combat with greater consideration than Japan was affording its own populace, what inference could be drawn regarding the comparative robustness of the two civilizations? As the year 1944 advanced, increasingly detailed testimonies emerged from Japanese individuals who had been taken prisoner, detailing everyday existence within American detention facilities. These accounts, initially disregarded as enemy disinformation, grew increasingly difficult to disregard as they coalesced into a unified portrayal of American plentifulness. Corporal Ichiro Sato, who was apprehended during the military engagement in the Marshall Islands, spent 18 months at Camp McCoy, situated in Wisconsin. His meticulously written correspondence to his family, discreetly transmitted through channels managed by neutral diplomatic entities, offered an unparalleled glimpse into the reality of life within American internment centers. Sato recounted, "We are roused by a bell signaling breakfast at 6:30 in the morning. We then form a line for eggs, genuine eggs, often 3 for each man, accompanied by strips of cured pork they refer to as bacon. There is bread with butter, seasonal fruits that vary, and milk, always milk. I have gained 30 pounds since my arrival here." Sato's most astonishing observations, however, pertain to American attitudes regarding the squandering of food. He noted, "Yesterday I observed a kitchen staff member discarding an entire loaf of bread simply because it had become slightly firm. In our village, such bread would have been highly prized, softened by soaking in water, and shared amongst numerous households. Here, they toss it to the birds and prepare fresh loaves. Another captive, Sergeant Tishi Nakamura, who was apprehended on Saipan, described his astonishment at the American facility's commissary system. Detainees could acquire supplementary provisions by utilizing remuneration earned from labor within the camp, typically amounting to 25 cents per diem for tasks in agriculture. Nakamura reported, "With my weekly earnings, I am able to purchase chocolate bars, tobacco, and occasionally frozen desserts. These items cost more than many Japanese households expend on sustenance in an entire month." Furthermore, American captives, their own servicemen held in German detention centers, routinely receive parcels containing such luxuries. The commissary arrangement illuminated another facet of American affluence that Japanese captives found exceedingly difficult to grasp. Not only were American detention facilities adequately provisioned, but American families possessed the financial means to dispatch luxury items to their relatives held captive abroad. Care packages dispatched by American families frequently contained coffee, confectionery, preserved meats, cigarettes, and personal effects that would have represented an insurmountable expense for the majority of Japanese families. Even during periods of peace, Japanese captives bore witness to American service members receiving these shipments and, on occasion, sharing their contents with their former adversaries. It was a demonstration of unforced generosity that spoke of a prosperity beyond the comprehension of the Japanese people. Prolonged exposure to American abundance began to instigate profound psychological shifts among the Japanese captives. Individuals who had been reared in a cultural milieu that extolled self-denial and hardship suddenly found themselves in an environment where plentifulness was taken for granted. This transformation was both corporeal and intellectual. The medical records from the detention camps documented not merely an increase in weight among the Japanese captives, but also enhancements in general health metrics. Dental ailments prevalent among Japanese servicemen due to inadequate nourishment began to resolve. Malnutrition-related diseases that had afflicted Japanese military units subsided within months of their internment by Americans. However, perhaps more significantly, Japanese captives commenced to question fundamental tenets concerning their nation and their participation in the conflict. Many had been instructed that Japan's material sacrifices were an unavoidable necessity due to widespread wartime austerity affecting the entire globe. This included food limitations, the use of substitute foodstuffs, and persistent scarcities. These circumstances were presented as universal conditions endured by all nations amidst the global conflagration. The American detention facilities utterly dismantled this narrative. If Americans could dispense frozen desserts to their adversaries while engaged in combat across multiple continents, then it was plausible that Japanese civilians were subjected to gratuitous suffering. It was conceivable that their leaders had made choices that prioritized military output over the well-being of individuals in a manner that was not strictly requisite for achieving victory. These realizations gave rise to what camp psychiatrists termed cognitive restructuring, a challenging process of re-establishing one's comprehension of reality when confronted with evidence that directly contradicts deeply held convictions. Some captives navigated this process more effectively than others. Individuals with strong familial ties often concentrated on survival and eventual repatriation, viewing their improved circumstances as a fleeting stroke of good fortune. However, younger soldiers, particularly those who had known only wartime conditions in Japan, sometimes underwent more profound alterations. Educational initiatives within the detention camps, permitted under the terms of the Geneva Conventions, offered further avenues for cultural exchange. Japanese captives participated in English language instruction, gained knowledge of American history and governance, and engaged in recreational pursuits previously unknown to them. Baseball emerged as a particularly significant cultural bridge. Numerous Japanese captives had heard of the sport, but had never actually played it. American camp guards organized informal leagues that included both detainees and staff, fostering interpersonal connections that transcended the dynamics of captor and captive. These interactions humanized the Americans in ways that directly contradicted years of dehumanizing propaganda. It becomes exceedingly difficult to perceive an individual as a subhuman brute when they are instructing you in the art of delivering a curveball or sharing their ice cream ration. Perhaps no single aspect of American wartime abundance appeared more fantastical to the Japanese captives than the accounts of floating ice cream vessels serving American troops in the Pacific. Nevertheless, these narratives were not only factual, but represented a deliberate strategic maneuver by the Americans to sustain troop morale through familiar comforts. The United States Navy's initiative concerning ice cream commenced in 1942, when military strategists recognized the impossibility of maintaining traditional morale-boosting activities, such as shore leave, entertainment, and familiar foods, during protracted campaigns in the Pacific. Unlike in the European theater, where American troops could occasionally visit cities like London or Paris, warfare in the Pacific necessitated months at sea, or stationed on isolated islands with virtually no recreational opportunities. Ice cream emerged as the solution. The Navy commissioned the construction of specialized refrigerated ships capable of producing thousands of gallons of ice cream daily. These vessels, colloquially termed ice cream barges, accompanied the Pacific Fleet, delivering frozen confections to combat units wherever they were deployed. The magnitude of this undertaking was extraordinary. At its zenith, the Navy's ice cream program was generating over 5,000 gallons daily for distribution to ships and island outposts. The available flavors span from vanilla and chocolate to strawberry and inventive tropical fruit, blends concocted from locally sourced ingredients. Japanese prisoners learned of these ice cream barges through contact with American personnel and from intelligence reports that circulated through the camp administrations. The psychological ramifications were devastating to Japanese morale. Here was irrefutable evidence that America possessed not only military supremacy, but also the capacity to dedicate entire vessels solely to the production of dessert for its fighting forces. While Japanese soldiers were rationing their rice and incorporating sawdust into their bread, American personnel were voicing complaints about the caliber of their daily ice cream allotments. The contrast became even more pronounced when prisoners became aware of American combat rations. K rations, the standard field meal for American soldiers, contained items such as chocolate bars, coffee, cigarettes, and preserved meats, luxuries that Japanese officers seldom encountered. C rations included provisions like canned peaches, beef stew, and crackers, which would have constituted a celebratory feast for Japanese troops. American servicemen frequently grumbled about these rations, viewing them as barely acceptable substitutes for proper meals. Japanese captives, overhearing these complaints, came to the realization that what Americans deemed unsatisfactory sustenance was, in fact, superior to the standard provisions allocated to Japanese military personnel. By the latter part of 1944, the cumulative psychological impact of American abundance was beginning to manifest in Japanese military performance. Intelligence assessments indicated an increase in the number of surrenders among Japanese troops, particularly in situations where continued resistance offered no viable prospect of success. The ingrained ethos of death before dishonor, which had characterized earlier Pacific engagements, was eroding. Soldiers who might previously have fought until their last round of ammunition were beginning to contemplate surrender as a logical alternative to a futile demise. This shift was not universal nor precipitous, but it was sufficiently noticeable to cause concern among Japanese military leadership. Reports from various Pacific commands documented instances where Japanese soldiers actively sought capture, rather than engaging in final, desperate charge maneuvers. The underlying reasons were multifaceted, but accounts of conditions within American detention facilities played a contributing role. Word circulated through Japanese units that capture by American forces might not result in torture and execution, but rather in living conditions superior to what many soldiers had experienced throughout their entire lives. For Japanese military commanders, this represented a catastrophic disintegration of combat resolve. If soldiers began to perceive enemy captivity as preferable to continued service, the very foundation of Japanese military discipline was imperiled. Desperate measures were subsequently implemented. The military police intensified their surveillance of troops for any indications of subversive sentiment. Soldiers found discussing conditions within American detention facilities faced severe penalties. Censorship of communications from prisoners was made even more stringent. However, information possesses an intrinsic capacity to disseminate, Irrespective of official suppression, soldiers conversed in hushed tones amongst themselves. Letters circumvented censorship measures. Narratives of frozen desserts and abundance circulated as clandestine rumors, incapable of complete eradication through any degree of military enforcement. Concurrently, on the Japanese home front, families started to assemble disquieting information concerning the actual trajectory of the war. The stark discrepancy between official pronouncements of American weakness and reports detailing the circumstances within American detention facilities generated cognitive dissonance that became progressively more difficult to dismiss. Mothers who had not encountered fresh milk in years learned that their captured sons were consuming it on a daily basis. Fathers laboring 12-hour shifts in wartime factories heard that American prisoners were participating in athletic events and attending educational sessions. Children who had forgotten the taste of sugar discovered that the adversaries of their nation were serving dessert to Japanese captives. The psychological impact reverberated through Japanese society in subtle yet significant ways. If America could afford such magnanimity towards its adversaries, what implications did this hold for Japan's prospects of victory? If American society was so exceptionally well provisioned that it could sustain peacetime standards of living even during a global conflict, how could Japan realistically hope to outlast such an opponent? These inquiries could not be voiced openly, but influenced private dialogues and individual choices. Factory workers began questioning the true necessity of their sacrifices if American laborers were apparently living in comfort. Farmers pondered the reasons for their own insufficient food production when American facilities appeared to possess limitless supplies. The erosion of morale on the home front was not dramatic or immediate, but it was steady and irreversible. Each new account concerning conditions in American detention centers added another fissure to the edifice of Japanese wartime unity. As the year 1945 commenced and Japan's military predicament grew increasingly dire, the genuine significance of American abundance became undeniably apparent. The ice cream served to Japanese prisoners was not merely a confection. It was tangible evidence of industrial capacity, agricultural surplus, and societal organization that Japan could not rival, even at its full wartime mobilization. The mobile ice cream production units, the well-supplied detention facilities, the casual disposal of food that would have been considered a treasure in Japan, all these pointed to a fundamental verity that Japanese leadership had been reluctant to acknowledge. They were engaged in conflict with an adversary whose resources dwarfed their own to an almost incomprehensible extent. Ultimately, the astonishment experienced by Japanese prisoners consuming ice cream in American camps represented more than a cultural surprise. It marked the moment when numerous Japanese soldiers first grasped the true scale of the war they were fighting and understood why their chances of victory had been illusory from the outset. The abundance that seemed beyond the realm of possibility for Japanese captives was, in reality, merely commonplace for Americans, even during the most calamitous war in human history. That realization, more than any military engagement or aerial bombardment campaign, initiated the psychological process that would ultimately culminate in Japan's capitulation. Today, as we reflect upon this extraordinary chapter of World War II history, the narrative of Japanese prisoners experiencing shock at the sight of American ice cream serves as a potent reminder of how material abundance can transmute into a weapon more formidable than any explosive device. The ice cream dispensed in American detention facilities was not intentionally conceived as psychological warfare, yet it effectively functioned as such. It demonstrated American strength not through displays of martial prowess, but through unprompted generosity that underscored the vast disparity between Japanese and American industrial capabilities. For the Japanese prisoners who directly encountered this affluence, ice cream became a symbol of a society so prosperous, so efficiently organized, and so assured of its ultimate triumph that it could extend benevolence to its adversaries. That benevolence, perhaps more than any act of aggression, convinced many Japanese soldiers that their war was unwinnable. In the final analysis, the most potent weapons are not always those designed for destruction, but rather those that illuminate truth. And the truth revealed by ice cream in American detention centers was that Japan had challenged an opponent whose strength lay not in its willingness to endure hardship, but in its capacity to provide plentifulness, even amidst a global conflict. The young Japanese soldiers who sat in mess halls in Kansas, gazing in disbelief at bowls of vanilla ice cream, were, in essence, witnessing the future. A future in which America's might would reshape the Pacific theater, bring the war to a close, and establish a new global order founded on abundance rather than self-denial. That ice cream, cold, sweet, and impossibly generous, was nothing less than the essence of victory itself.